Hello internet friends, I'm UB, and today we're going to work on a cosplay project. So, let's get started. Twyla. Of course I'm joking. However, Twyla did have a very intense goal for her cosplaying this year. So what is a lute? It's basically a medieval instrument, a string instrument to be precise, and a theorbo, I have learned, is an extended version of a lute. So there's multiple things that I have to take into account with this project, one of which being that I have to be able to ship this theorbo prop to Twyla. But by looking at different diagrams and the like of theorbos and lutes, I think I figured out essentially what I want to do here. Let's get started with making a pattern, and that way I'll be able to see what size of pieces I'm working with before I cut it out in cardboard. And it was at this point that I realized just how ludicrously ginormous this thing was going to end up. If you're interested in making your own lute at home for a cosplay or costume, I'll be putting a pattern up based off of what I was able to put together here so that you can make your own lute head out of paper mache. And just like that, we have a complete pattern for the head of the theorbo. I'm not 100% sure if my math is even accurate on these curves. I think it's going to be okay. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces here that I need to cut out of cardboard and get stuck together, and that's kind of my goal for today. So let's start cutting. So now that I have all of my pieces cut out and my supports cut and have a popsicle stick or tongue depressor, whatever you want to call them, on the center of each one, I want to get each support in the right spot on the face, and I'm going to use these little guys and some toothpicks to make it happen. So let's get started. And while we wait for that to dry, I think I'm just gonna mix up some paper clay because I think that's our next step. I think that's basically where we want to be. All right, and now that those two surfaces are squished together, that glorious goop is going to kind of marry together on each side and make a really tight bond. And now we wait. While I waited for the rubber cement to dry, I mixed up a fresh batch of paper clay, which you can see the process for on another one of my recent videos. And the paper clay was basically used to fill in the top and bottom portions of the head of the theorbo. In real theorbos, these would be wooden chunks that were whittled out to the right shape. But paper clay actually worked really well in this instance and kept it very lightweight as well. It's at this point in the process that things became very experimental because I didn't really know how to approach making the shell on the head of the Theorbo. The back pieces, I guess you could say. And I started out trying to do some really convoluted math, but then I realized that I could take a piece out of the seamstress book and make a pattern for myself out of newspaper. A lot of people will use garbage bags for this to wrap whatever shape they need and then cut the pattern pieces that they need out of that. But we are a little bit of an eco-friendly channel here, so we're going to use newspaper and wrap up the head of the Theorbo as tightly as we can like a Christmas present, and then mark out the pattern pieces that we want and cut those out from there. After we got the newspaper portions of this pattern cut out, I took those pieces and traced them onto a little bit sturdier paper to make the actual end pattern out of. I traced these and then used a blue marker to kind of clean up my lines a little bit before I cut them out. In the end, there were 13 pieces that went into the back of the Theorbo. 6 on each side, and a middle piece. I almost ran out of cardboard on this project, and I didn't think that would be an issue I would run into because I am a monger of cardboard, if that's even a thing. But the thing is, I just didn't have enough in my stash, and thankfully we had a lot of deliveries coming in. I was able to use some of the boxes from that, but it came pretty close on this one. All right, so I've got all of the little pieces that are going to go over the shell of the head of the Theorbo here. So what I'm going to try to do here is I'm going to wet down my strips just a little bit so that they have a little more curve ability to them. And then I'm going to use these old junk nails to connect each strip as it goes down the head of the Theorbo, hold it in place as it dries, and the last layer is going to be this craft paper that I've gotten in multiple packages over time, and I'm just going to basically lay it over top and use some watered down glue to make everything stay, and then we'll let it all dry and come back tomorrow. Originally, I thought I was going to create the shell of the Theorbo separately from the rest of the body, but by the time I got all of these nails in, I realized that they provided quite a bit of support. I hadn't planned on keeping them in because they were going to add some weight to the shipping, but in the end, they actually didn't add a ton of weight, and the entire thing with the neck ended up being less than 10 pounds. Pretty close to 6 pounds, actually, but when I got everything in the box with the packaging materials, it was close to 10. I even ended up throwing away a couple of the pieces that I made because my math just wasn't right in the end. Then I made a shell of paper mache over top of the cardboard and made sure to get around all of the little nooks and crannies I needed to, let that dry, and then put a final layer of craft paper on top to create a more seamless look in the end. Doing this process gave me immense respect for people who have made musical instruments in the past and who make them now, because this process was not very precise on my part. And to make something like this out of something much less forgiving than paper mache blows my mind. Okay, so while the head of the Theorbo is drying, and I think it might have to sit overnight, what we're going to work on is the long neck.
Hey, there are long necks just like you, Littlefoot.
Yeah.
So, based off of all of the cool measurements that this diagram gave me, I was able to do a little bit of math and decide where the connection points I want are going to be in the neck. These connection points are so that the Theorbo can be packed into a box and sent to Twyla. I'm really nervous about putting this together, so I guess the answer to that is to just get started. This is another piece of trial and error, as I created this to be the portions of the neck of the Theorbo, basically layering cardboard that I could then put paper clay over. And the idea was that it would kind of function like Lincoln logs, where one end would have a peg, one end would have a hole, and they would slot into each other and kind of lock in. All right, I was super excited when I woke up and saw this guy this morning, so I've done a couple of steps without you guys. Let's take a look. So I went to the store and I got some more contact cement and put that around the edges here after I trimmed off the excess. Truthfully, there is definitely a way to do this without putting any tape on the head. There was a portion of this where the edges came together really nicely, but the rest of it, not so much, and I am working with a deadline, so I just used some painter's tape on the edges to make sure that everything is encapsulated, and then a little bit on the back here as well, just because there's a lot of material here, and I think it's going to turn out really great. So today's goal is to get a base coat of paint on this guy. As far as the neck on the lute goes, I did start something yesterday, and I think I'm gonna completely scrap it. I was thinking about it last night when I couldn't sleep, and I realized that I really want to have a wooden core to connect all of the different pieces of the neck together. So I went to the hardware store. I got a yard sign fence post, basically. It isn't the most sturdy wood or anything, but it should give me a really good base for the pieces to run through the middle of the neck of the lute. With that being said, I don't have any specific ideas on how to incorporate this into the lute yet. I'm going to clean off my work surface and get started on base coats, and then I'll come around to this part of the project. The thought behind using this particular paint for my base coats came in two waves. Firstly, this paint was left over from old tenants of this house from before I moved in, and so it might as well get used. Secondly, orange and blue are opposites on the color wheel, and for those of you who aren't artsy like me, basically that meant that the orange was going to cancel out the blue on the painter's tape that I used. We got these all put together, and I'm really impressed with what I was able to accomplish here. It's got good shape, and I think if I sanded it down, it would look pretty good. But these are pretty bulky. I don't know if I'm super into that. I don't think I want to move forward with it. So I decided to go to the hardware store and grab some actual wood pieces that I can make the neck of the Theorbo out of, mostly because they're gonna be about the same weight, and I think they're just going to be sturdier and more polished for Twyla at the con. So with that being said, I need to cut these down to size, and I think I'm just going to use some hinges and general hardware that I ordered online to make this function the way that Twyla needs it to. My partner Nathaniel was so helpful in getting these cut down to size, but I hadn't realized that we didn't own the right kind of saw to be doing this kind of work. So it kind of turned out a little wobbly, and I used some wood filler to just fill in those really big crevices and try to make things a little less inconsistent. And what you can see me doing here is marking out where I wanted each hole to go for the pegs on the Theorbo. In the end, some of the holes that I had drilled in the head of the Theorbo way at the top were a little bit wonky, and I should have been a little more careful. But overall, this turned out pretty great, especially for a prop. I also got very excited and decided to start laying out my hardware here, and then I realized that it would probably be smart to paint these pieces before I put the hardware on. That way we're not getting paint on the hardware. So that's what I did. This again is paint that we just haven't used around the house, and so it is getting put to good use. I really worked hard to get that paint into the holes for the pegs, and it turned out to be very fortuitous because once there was paint in those holes, it was tight enough for the pegs to stay on their own, and I didn't have to worry about gluing them in or anything like that. It's at this point that I could really see the vision of this project coming together, and I was actually really excited, even if you can't see it on my face. I finally got all the hardware on, and it just started to really become a vision. Hello, it is another day, and another thing I need to work on today is the details that go into the head of a Theorbo. Something that I noticed on a lot of the reference photos I found on Google is that there's 3 little round insignias that go on most Theorbos. What I want to do before I do my base coat of paint on here is make those insignias and actually embed them into the cardboard here. It might make things a little messy, but I think the little bit of detail is really going to pop. So I designed some insignias designed after polyhedral dice because this character that Twyla is cosplaying as was a tabletop RPG character that she played in a game that we played in together, and that game was called Totally Not Monsters. Our friend Joe DM'd it, and you should totally check out his art stuff. He is a fantastic digital painter, writer, and jack of all trades, just like me. If you like my stuff, you'll probably like his too. Going back to these insignias, I really didn't get the detail that I was hoping to get in these, and in the future I would like to use a laser cutter or CNC router of some sort to get the level of detail that I was hoping for in this project, but for the budget that we had and the materials that we had, I'm very happy with the end result. I had to try a couple of different methods to make the numbers in the center of the die. I think I like the method that I used for the D12 on the bottom here, but you'll have to let me know what you think in the comments. Hi there. So, we've got our insignias on the front of this guy. What we're gonna do is just do some base coats of paint on here and let them dry today while I do some video editing. So, I've got my paint water mug, I've got my paintbrush, I've got my paint back here. Let's rock and roll. I used wood filler on the front of the Theorbo quite a bit, and I had to do many different layers of it where I would apply the wood filler, sand, apply, and sand until I felt that the insignias were more or less flush with the rest of the front of the Theorbo. And after all of that, I was able to base coat the front of the Theorbo in this lighter brown that I actually mixed for my Mimic video a while back. Then I took out my airbrush, and the plan was always to airbrush this, but I wasn't exactly sure what my method was going to be, so I started with this brown color that I have, but it's always a little more red-orange than I would like. And so putting it on top of the orange base coat kind of didn't help that. After that, I played with a lot of the shadows, and I always tell my clients at this point in the project to trust the process and it will look fantastic when I put the final highlights on. And I should have listened to my own advice there because I really had to play with this a lot before I finally put my highlights on and it all came together. At this point, I used some of that same light brown I did on the front in order to kind of tone down the orange that was happening on the Theorbo and basically make it less pumpkin-y, but that drowned out so much of the color that I had to do a very watered down coat of orange-brown on top. And then I finally got to the details. Hello. So, it's my birthday, and I have to finish this thing. It haunts my dreams. Definitely not Twyla's fault. I just bit off more than I could chew, which is kind of how my life goes. So, we've got our hardware put on, so this guy can fold up for transport and all of that. We've also got little locks on the front here. This piece, the neck, needs some touch-up paint for sure. The other thing I installed was this little hook, and that is what's going to hook into the shoulder strap. This plate was added so that it could attach seamlessly to the rest of the Theorbo. There's a plane going overhead. Anyway, the other thing I'm going to do today is flip this guy over, and on the base part of the neck, I'm gonna use my pocket hole guide to put a couple of holes in here, and then what's gonna happen is that piece is just gonna get drilled straight into the butt of the head of the Theorbo for Twyla. The other thing that I kind of figured out just thinking about things last night is I want to protect this guy with some Mod Podge. There's a little bit of damage here just from moving it around and the acrylic paint basically flaking off. So I want to coat the whole thing in Mod Podge once I'm done painting it, which I am not done painting it at all. So that's what I'm going to tackle today. Pocket holes, painting this, clear coating it, and then hopefully getting all the details on the neck. I wasn't 100% sure what to do here either, but essentially I took paper clay and sculpted the little bits and details that I knew I would need for the instrument, including the frets, the string rest kind of thing, and I tried to make the head out of paper clay, but I would later scrap that. And then I used a combination of wood glue and paper clay to make all of that stick to the neck. And it turned out really great. After it was all painted, it all stuck together beautifully. And then I went in with my black and I did a very light dry brush on the front insignias of the Theorbo and went in with a small detail brush to fill in the sort of caverns or crevices that naturally would be there if this lute was made of wood. And then I had to go in and do a little bit of touch-up paint just to make them seem organic. Stringing this guy was no small feat, and I really took a lot of care to try and make the string rest notches line up with where the strings were going to go, but in the end, I must have just accidentally shifted that string rest a little bit, and so none of the strings actually lined up very well by the time I was done. But the really cool thing about paper clay is you can drill it just like wood, and that's how I was able to prep these nail holes before I installed the string rest. And then a little dab of E6000 on the back helped to make sure that the strings were all traveling in the correct direction. At this point, I was pretty burnt out, so I had to go off camera to figure out what the head of the Theorbo was going to look like, and basically I used a small piece of wood and some paper clay to make a sort of curve at the top and make it have a little bit of ornateness to it. And then what you can see here is I 3D modeled the pegs that I wanted. There's 13 strings on this thing, so I needed 13 pegs, and my awesome partner Nathaniel started to 3D print them for me, and our 3D printer broke down. Narrowly, he was able to save the day and get all of them printed that I needed, and we just kind of did what we had to do to get this together. Lastly, I needed to make a shoulder strap for the Theorbo because I always envision a lute being held by a bard, like, on their back as they walk down a dusty trail. So I cut out the pieces that I would need from fabrics that I found in my stash, made a tapered end so that it could fit into the hardware that I had bought from Lowe's, and then sewed down the edges. Turned it inside out, which was actually a lot harder than you would think it is, but we got there. And then I put a line of stitching down each side of that finished piece just to make sure that it laid nice and flat. Once all that was done, I installed the hardware on the ends, and the rest is history. After 14 work days, we finally finished this thing. It ended up about 6 inches taller than I had intended, but it turned out so good, and it did make it to Twyla safe. And that's a wrap on a very big project. Thank you so much for getting to the end of the video. Here's 1,000 experience points just for that. I know that this was a very long video, and I'm so grateful that you stuck around. If you'd like to support me, please go to patreon.com/ubdraws. I'll leave a link in the description. Like and subscribe, it really helps me out. I'm a very small channel just trying to get my legs on YouTube, and honestly, I'm very, very proud of the edit on this video. This is literally the last part that I'm doing, and then I can move on to a smaller project to let my brain breathe a little bit. We're off next week, but I will see you in 2 weeks from now. Don't forget to drink some water.
and have a great rest of your day.